Okay, we're going to talk about the Gospels today. The word gospel itself comes from the Old English or German, gut Spiel, if I can quote my Latin teacher, the good news. The gospel is the good news about Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection. It comes from a Greek word, evangelion, and evangelion is the origins of the word evangelist. The evangelists are people who wrote the Gospels, or an evangelical preacher is somebody who's spreading the good news, or a televangelist is somebody who tells the good news on TV. So evangelion means good news, and gospel means good news. We need to remember that the Gospels came out of an oral tradition, that when Jesus died and rose from the dead and appeared to his followers, those followers ran out and began to tell the whole world that Jesus had risen from the dead and what he had said and what his message was all about. They believed the world was coming to an end, and they wanted to let people know as quickly as possible so that they could follow the example of Jesus and rise from the dead as well. So for probably 20, 30 years, the stories of Jesus were passed along orally from one group to another. And obviously things happen when you transmit messages orally. The first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, wasn't written until probably the 60s. And I'm not talking about the Vietnam and hippies 60s. I'm talking about the year 60. We're pretty sure that Mark was written before the year 70 because Mark does not make any specific reference to the destruction of the temple, which was a huge event that occurred in 70 CE. And the Gospel of Mark seems to have been circulated among the different Christian communities. And as other Christian communities read this, they decided, hey, we should write our own version of the story. Again, the early Christian community thought the world was going to end, and so they weren't really interested in writing down the Gospels or the stories of Jesus until they figured out that maybe he's not coming right back. Maybe it'll be a few decades, or maybe even 50 or 100 years. And as the eyewitnesses to the resurrection died off, the communities came together and said, let's write down the stories that we have. So Mark's is the first written gospel we have in the canon of Scripture, and it seems to have been circulated and seems to have inspired the writing of two more gospels. The communities of Luke and Matthew, and try not to think about these as a single person named Luke sitting down at a typewriter and writing a gospel, but a community that attributes its source to Luke as writing down the stories of Jesus. The Gospel of Luke is based on the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of Matthew is based on the Gospel of Mark. And both Luke and Matthew seem to have their own stories that have been passed on orally that they then add to their gospel. So Matthew adds things like the parable of the unforgiving servant and the story of the workers in the vineyard. Luke also seems to have access to other stories from the oral tradition, stories like the Good Shepherd or the lost sheep and the story of the prodigal son, among others. And then Luke and Matthew also seem to have access to some other source of information. But generally, Luke includes almost everything in Mark, and Matthew includes everything in Mark, plus they add some material to it. There are a few things that Mark wrote down that weren't added to Luke or Matthew, but generally almost everything from the Gospel of Mark made it into both or either Luke or Matthew. There are other things such as the Lord's Prayer and the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, that Luke and Matthew have in common, and they didn't come from Mark. There seems to have been some other source of information from which Luke and Matthew got some sayings of Jesus. And for years, scholars scratched their heads. They couldn't, pinpoint it. And finally, I think it was German theologians who came up with the idea of calling this mystery source Q. And the word, or the letter Q, is the initial of the German word Quelle, which means the source. So Luke's gospel is made up mostly of material from Mark, plus some stuff that's unique to Luke, and some stuff that Luke included from Kvele. Matthew's gospel, again, includes most of the material from Mark as a basis, some material that's unique to Matthew, the M material, and then some material that Luke also had access to called Kvele. Please note that there's no arrows back and forth between Luke and Matthew. Luke tells a story of Jesus as a baby where shepherds come and visit him and doesn't mention wise men. Matthew tells a story where wise men come and visit baby Jesus, but there's no shepherds. In Luke's gospel, an angel appears to Mary. In Matthew's gospel, the angel appears to Joseph. So there doesn't seem to be any conversation back and forth between Matthew and Luke. Otherwise, presumably, they would have done more to get their stories straight with each other. So Mark and Luke and Matthew are very, very similar to each other, and they are referred to collectively. Some scholars think that Q might be like Thomas, and hopefully we'll talk about Thomas at some point in class. These three Gospels, Mark and Luke and Matthew, are known as the Synoptic Gospel. A synonym is a word that means the same as something else. Synoptic means the same eye or the same viewpoint or the same perspective. Mark and Luke and Matthew all tell a very similar story to Jesus because they're based on Mark's gospel as a basis. The Gospel of Mark, written sometimes before the year 70, Luke and Matthew sometime after, 70s or 80s. And then finally, the Gospel of John comes along, and John seems to be familiar with the Synoptic Gospels and includes some elements, changes some elements, but writes a gospel that's very, very different. So these three are the Synoptic Gospels, and they will agree on certain events, and John's gospel is very, very different from them. I'm going to run through a lot of different things. Mark's gospel was written for Gentiles. This was meant to be a funny joke. Jews do not eat pork, they don't eat bacon. So Mark was writing for Gentile Christians, people who became Christians and they weren't Jewish. Please make sure you spell the word Gentiles correctly, Gentiles. Matthew's gospel, on the other hand, seems to be written for people who became Christian who were Jews, Jewish Christians. A lot of Jewish references there. Luke's community seems to have a big mix of both Gentile Christians and Jewish Christians, and also seems to have a big socioeconomic spread as well. Luke seems to have some very wealthy people in the community and some very poor people in the community. And John's gospel is also written for Jewish Christians. And it's interesting that Matthew and John are written for people who had been Jews who became Christians, and they can also be seen as anti-Semitic because there was tension between the Jewish Jews and the Jewish Christians, and that comes out in Matthew and John in ways that can be perceived as anti-Semitic when viewed today. Mark's gospel is written for Christians who are suffering persecution, and Mark's gospel really emphasizes the humanity of Jesus and the suffering of Jesus. Matthew's gospel focuses on, again, the Jewishness of Jesus and makes lots of connections between Jesus and Moses, the great lawgiver, or Jesus and King David. Matthew quotes a lot of the Old Testament prophets. Luke emphasizes Jesus as the Messiah for the poor, the Messiah who's the compassionate one, the forgiving one, the all-welcoming Messiah. And John's gospel, kind of the opposite of Mark, which emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, John's gospel emphasizes the divinity of Jesus. Jesus is God, and he knows it. This, by the way, is a mosaic that's found in the National Basilica in Washington, D.C., and this is about 40 feet across. This is one of the scariest Jesuses, in my opinion, I've ever seen. He's ripped, he's muscular, he's got flames coming out of his head. He's a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, angry Jesus. He kind of feels to me more like a super race sort of Jesus from the Nazi era, whereas Mark is portraying Jesus as more of a Jesus of Auschwitz, a suffering Jewish Jesus. But each gospel has its own perspective on who Jesus is. Mark's gospel, the first one written, is the shortest gospel. It starts with Jesus being baptized about age 30 by John the Baptist. It tells about his ministry and then his death and a very, very brief resurrection story. Matthew's gospel is the longest of all the gospels. It's placed first in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because it's seen as being the most complete. And Matthew's gospel, in addition to being long in terms of the number of parables and teachings and miracle stories, it also adds a baby Jesus story, as I mentioned briefly earlier. Luke's gospel, again, written about the same time as Matthew, based on Mark, just like Matthew is. The author of Luke also wrote the book of Acts, and there's some connections between the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. Luke also adds an infancy story, an infancy narrative about Jesus, but again, it's a different story of baby Jesus than Matthew presents. And then John's Gospel, the last one written in the 90s, scholars think, contains no parables, which in Mark and Matthew and Luke seems to be the way that Jesus taught. Instead, Jesus gives long symbolic speeches. They're often connected to a miracle. There's very, very highly developed theology in John's, but it's a very, very different gospel than the synoptics. We make use of the Gospels in church through the lectionary, the book of readings in church. And the three synoptic Gospels are read on a 3-year rotation, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the synoptic Gospels are read in a 3-year rotation where Matthew would be read in 2020, Mark in 2021, Luke in 2022, and then back to Matthew, Mark, Luke, etc., etc., etc. I'm oversimplifying things a little bit, but I don't want to get too complex here. John's gospel isn't read during ordinary time the same way that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are in a 3-year rotation. It actually is added to year B a little bit because Mark's short. You don't need to write that down. But John gets a lot of airplay every year during the seasons of Lent and Easter. So during ordinary time, when we're hearing about the teachings of Jesus and the life of Jesus, we get Matthew, the Jewish Jesus, Mark, the human suffering Jesus, Luke, the very forgiving Jesus, Jesus for the poor. And then every year during the season of Lent, we get a lot of John. And during Easter season, we get a lot of the Last Supper speeches of Jesus from John as well. Our chronology for Holy Week is actually based on John. The Last Supper is on Thursday, the night before the Sabbath, and then Jesus is crucified on Friday, just before the Sabbath begins, whereas Matthew, Mark, and Luke have Jesus, the Last Supper, as a Passover meal, so a day later than John. Every year during the Christmas season, we get Matthew and Luke's opening chapters, what we know as the infancy narratives, the baby Jesus stories. And again, the baby Jesus stories in Matthew and Luke are very different from each other, but they kind of get blended together sometimes when you do a Christmas pageant or things like that.